in particular the business community here in North Texas and in Fort Worth specifically. I'm Daniel Pullen, and I have the distinct honor of serving as the John V. Roach Dean here at TCU's Neely School of Business, which is one of the really great business schools in the country for a heck of a lot of reasons, not the least of which is our deep partnership with the private sector. In fact, the Tandy Executive Speaker Series would not be possible without the generosity of a number of our private sector collaborators, including our platinum sponsor for this year's series, Frost, our gold sponsor, the Fort Worth Business Press, silver sponsors, the Balcom Agency and Lindbeck, and bronze sponsors, Acme Brick, Byrne Construction, McDonald Sanders, Dunaway, and Gensler. We could not do this without you, and appreciate the deep investment that you're making in these types of conversations that benefit our school, our students, and the broader business community against which we have the good fortune of operating against. Some of you know that I've been at TCU for about a year and a half, and what a year and a half it's been. One of the things that attracted my wife Tamara and I to TCU was the deep culture that has been built over the years, over generations of Horned Frogs that really allow us to work together in good times and in tough times to still progress. And certainly that was a feature and a benefit for us as we made the move to Fort Worth. And boy, did we need that culture now more than ever, given the unprecedented circumstances that we all operate against. One of the really distinctive things in the Neely School of Business is that, unlike most business schools in this country, we actually make a brand promise to our stakeholders each and every day, and we call that commitment the Neely Promise, which is to unleash human potential with leadership at the core and innovation in our spirit. And boy, have we leaned into that promise during this COVID period. We have had to summon all of our leadership capabilities, our business sensibilities. We've had to rely on a healthy dose of innovation to help us get through this in such a constructive and positive way. I'm very proud of our faculty and staff who really turned on a dime this spring to move all of our instruction to a remote format. We hadn't had a lot of experience in remote instruction here at TCU, but again, the innovation and the commitment and that strength of culture allowed us to do that at a very high quality. Over the summer, I'm proud of our faculty. 100%, including myself, went back to school and did some deep training to develop best practices and expertise on remote teaching and teaching in a hybrid and multimodality format. We also redesigned 100% of our business courses across the whole school this summer, which means we have a very well-trained, prepared, and very current and relevant curriculum, which I think is going to be a strength of ours as we look ahead into the next chapter of the 21st century. Just as many private sector companies, including automakers, were having to adjust how they responded to the pandemic, including a very famous story about how automakers were shifting production lines from away from automobiles to make ventilators. We actually did the same thing. We saw that many of our graduating students were needing oxygen in a professional way. Many of their job offers were being pulled at a moment's notice, and they needed our support. So instead of taking the 3-year normal cycle to develop a new graduate program to help provide continuing educational opportunities for those graduating seniors whose circumstances had shifted, we did a 3-week triage job and created our own ventilator, which is the Masters of Science in Business Analytics, which allowed 50 students, most of them from TCU graduating seniors, to earn a master's degree in business analytics and upskill and be prepared for entering the workforce in hopefully a different climate. We leaned into our alumni and the business leaders of this community. We sent out a call for help. And you, together with our amazing career placement team, helped save over 150 students and created 150 new jobs that didn't exist to help our Horned Frogs whose circumstances had changed. And so I'll never forget that, and I cannot thank you enough for being there when we needed you. At the same time, we're very firmly committed to our our absolute goal of creating an accessible and inclusive learning environment. We recently opened the Neely Office of Inclusive Excellence to help our students and faculty and staff and business partners, create a learning environment that celebrates a diversity of people and a diversity of ideas. Our students are on the move. They've been helping in the community, partnering with the Fort Worth Chamber of Commerce, the Hispanic Chamber of Commerce here in town, to really invest in small businesses, providing consulting services to help those enterprises make it through this tough time. And all the while, into all of these headwinds, I'm pleased to report that our academic profile continues to rise. We just celebrated rises in the U.S. News rankings at both our MBA program and our undergraduate business program. And we have returned to the top 15 in the nation for our entrepreneurship program. So very exciting times, very uncertain times, but again, our promise of leadership, innovation, and the depth of our culture and your commitment, your co-investment in our progress has everything to do with our success. So continuing that excitement is today's session. It's my pleasure to introduce the chairman and CEO of Cullen and Frost Bankers, Inc., Phil Green, our platinum sponsor for today, who will introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Dean Pullen. I'm proud to introduce our speaker, Robert Kaplan. Rob just marked his 5th anniversary serving as the president and CEO of the Federal Reserve Bank of Dallas. He represents the 11th Federal Reserve District on the Federal Open Market Committee in the formulation of U.S. monetary policy, as well as overseeing the 1,200 employees of the Dallas Fed. I've had a chance to know Rob well through my membership on the Federal Advisory Council, and I think you'll agree that he's thoughtful and knowledgeable about the issues facing Texas and the overall economy. And I can tell you firsthand that he is a well-respected thought leader in his service to the highest levels of the Federal Reserve System. Rob is a former vice chairman of Goldman Sachs, former Harvard professor, and author of a number of books on leadership. His accessibility and willingness to speak in forums like this have helped people understand the influence of an institution like the Federal Reserve. Rob will speak on the economy for about 15 minutes, and then we'll have a Q&A with Dean Pullen. Please welcome Robert Kaplan.
Thank you, Phil. I appreciate that. President Kaplan, it's all yours.
Thank you, and thank you, Dean Pullen, and thank you, Phil. Phil's a great board member for us at the Dallas Fed and provides us with great insight. So as Phil mentioned, I'm going to talk just for a few minutes, a brief overview, and then we'll go to questions. So let me start with the overall economy. As everyone in this audience knows, the U.S. economy contracted somewhere in the neighborhood of 33% annualized in the second quarter of this year. As we dealt with COVID, dealt with the shutdowns, and the aftermath of that. It's our sense that the economy bottomed probably sometime in April and then began to improve in May and in June. And we started to grow out of this at a relatively rapid rate. That rebound probably stalled out a little bit based on looking at our high frequency data, probably stalled out a little bit around mid-June because of a resurgence of the virus. And it's not that growth didn't continue, it's just the pace of growth flattened out a bit. The pace of the recovery flattened out a little bit. With measures that were taken throughout the United States to stem the resurgence of the virus, we think the rate of growth started to improve again sometime in middle of August and into September. And right now, we'll have to see what happens. We're dealing with a potential resurgence, and we'll see if that materializes. What does all that mean for GDP? Even with those fits and starts I just described, it's our best estimate at the Dallas Fed that third quarter GDP in the United States, i.e. for the quarter ended September 30th, is going to show GDP growth of 30% positive annualized. So a very strong quarter of growth. And we think the fourth quarter is also going to show strong growth. We think we'll end this year with an unemployment rate below 8%. Our best judgment right now is it'll be around 7.5%. And we think 2021 we'll show above trend growth, and we're going to grow in excess of 3% in the United States, and we'll continue to grind down the unemployment rate. Now, there's two big caveats to that forecast. Caveat number one is how will we manage the virus? In those forecasts, we're not necessarily assuming that there's going to be a vaccine, although we understand somewhere in that time frame there will be one. But we are assuming that we do a good job in following the public health protocols, wearing masks, social distancing, and we continue to do a good job managing this virus. And the second thing I'm assuming in that forecast is we do get some sort of fiscal package. And there are two main parts of that fiscal package. One will be continued unemployment benefits, not necessarily at $600 additional benefit, but at some level. It's going to be critical. We think that that's going to get passed. And then we would also hope that there'll be some package of aid to state and local governments. They've got big fiscal holes from earlier in the year, and why businesses rebounded and tax receipts have rebounded. They're going to need to cut costs and basically fire people in order to balance their budgets. And when I talk to mayors and governors throughout the country, they are either in the process of letting people go or they're about to do that if they don't think they're going to get relief. At the same time, they're being asked to shoulder a greater burden of fighting the virus, getting kids back in school, and everything else. So those are two caveats. Let me say a couple other things about what we're seeing. One of the unique things about this downturn is consumer spending has stayed relatively solid throughout the entire downturn. You normally do not see that when you have a contraction in GDP. Incomes go down, consumer spending goes down. We have not seen that. Why haven't we seen it? Part of the reason is the very rapid and sizable monetary and fiscal responses that helped people that lost their jobs still have an income and still be able to spend, and other actions that were taken that helped stabilize consumer spending. So that's been a surprise. The other part of this recovery that is concerning is the disproportionate negative effect it's had, the virus has had on lower income groups, Blacks particularly, and Hispanics. Going into this pandemic, we had seen a very tight labor force, 3.5% unemployment rate, and we'd seen the gap between Blacks and Hispanics and the rest of the population. We'd seen the gap in the unemployment rate narrow, and we saw some improvement in income inequality. And unfortunately, as a result of the pandemic, we've taken a step back. Now, why is that? I think all our research shows that if you've got a college education or better, there's a very good chance that you're able to successfully work remotely. If, on the other hand, you've got a high school education or less, you're more likely to work in a person-to-person service business. You are less likely to have the option to work remotely. So therefore, you're more likely to have lost your job and to suffer an income loss. And so I think coming out of this pandemic, we've got a lot of repair work to do that's going to take, I think, much more investments in early childhood literacy, improving secondary education, but particularly a dramatic increase in investment in skills training to help get people with a high school education or less, get them back into the workforce and get them employed again. And I think some of these people who've lost their jobs will not have businesses to go back to, or even industries to go back to, and they may have to get retrained and get into a new function or a new industry, and that's time consuming. But GDP growth and how well we recover is going to depend very much on how well we do that. So that would be one other thing I would point out. And so I guess I'll make another comment about Texas then. So how's Texas done versus the nation? We seem to be performing at least as well as the country, and at times outperforming. Now, one of the negatives is we've had our own resurgence that probably has been worse than other places in the country, but we seem to have that more under control. But even with that, we've seen the same type of pattern in recovery in Texas as we've seen in the rest of the country. And the only comment I would make, and I've been making, to the extent we are disciplined about wearing masks, social distancing, and following these public health protocols, we're going to grow faster. We're going to have a lower unemployment rate. We're going to need to spend less money on fiscal policy. And all the way around, it's going to be better for the country. And that's why I've said many times, monetary policy is critical. Fiscal policy is very important. But the most powerful economic tool we have right now is adherence to these public health protocols. And so with that, I could talk about a lot of other things, but let me stop there and turn to Dan.
All right. Well, thank you, President Kaplan. Appreciate that outlook on for the national economy and then, of course, Texas economy. Can we take it one step further? How does that play out at the global stage?
So we spend a lot of time studying how countries around the world are managing the virus. For one reason is to get clues on some of the things we may be going through. So for example, right now, the UK and Europe seem to be going through a resurgence, and we're trying to figure out, does that mean that it's coming here next, or we're going to deal with the same problems? But the long and the short of it is this. In the rest of the world, by and large, with some exceptions, there were very tough lockdowns. And maybe I would observe probably tougher even in Europe, certainly in China, other countries, Japan, probably tougher lockdowns than the one we had here. And so their initial loss from the virus was more significant. Having said that, they got the incidence down lower than we did before they reopened. And by and large, their reopenings seem to have gone better. And when they talk about a resurgence in China or another country, we're talking about a resurgence that's a fraction of the new cases that we have here. And so you're going to see healthy rebounds around, and you are seeing healthy rebounds around the world. You're seeing a very healthy rebound in China, probably more significant than ours. And you're seeing a broader return to a range of activities in China than we're seeing here, including flying on airplanes. And probably a little bit more discipline, although it goes ebbs and flows, but more discipline in following the public health protocols. But the last thing I'd say, we had a bigger fiscal response and monetary policy response than probably any other country in the world. And that's helped mitigate some of the negative effects of managing the virus.
Well, I appreciate that view, and obviously those mitigating effects are going to play out at the individual level and across America's families. We have sort of an unprecedented confluence of events, right? We have the financial challenges of our time. We have health and safety uncertainty due to the pandemic. We've got deep concerns around social justice, and then we've got a presidential election forthcoming just a matter of weeks. Are all of these circumstances, are they further perpetuating this longstanding notion of a disappearing middle class? You talked about some of the disproportionate impacts on Blacks and Hispanics and those without college education. Is this a real crucible moment for the middle class?
I mean, I think it is, and I think there's some things that monetary policy can do, and what we've said, and we just published a new framework that's an evolution from our previous framework, which basically gets at this, which is we're basically saying in the future, we're going to be willing to run the labor force tighter to bring in some of these underrepresented groups. And we think we'll be able to do that because inflation appears to be more muted. But it's going to take a number of other actions away from monetary policy. And again, those will be particularly an investment in education, particularly, again, early childhood literacy. Too many of our kids are not getting to first grade reading at grade level, but it's going to take a substantial ramp up. And we've already had one ramp up, but I think it's going to have to go a lot further in skills training. And we believe that if we make those investments, we can narrow this gap. The other thing we're seeing is there needs to be infrastructure. There are infrastructure holes in the country also that affect this the middle class, and that there's some parts of the country and some areas, even in big cities, that don't have a good access to Wi-Fi. And you can imagine if before it was a problem not having good access to Wi-Fi, you know, now you can imagine how that affects trying to do business, kids learning, and every other aspect of society. So we need some greater investments that will help level the playing field. And the reason all these investments and why this matters, what you're referring to, GDP growth is made up of growth in the workforce and growth in productivity. And if we don't address these issues, we're going to have slower workforce growth, and we're going to have a less productive workforce. It just means lower GDP. In a country that's very highly leveraged at the government level, we need to grow faster in order to service this debt and manage this this budget deficit.
Well, you mentioned earlier, you know, that direct correlation between not just monetary policy, fiscal policy, but also adherence to safety protocols, and how that's really that can be a important either a tailwind or the lack of adherence being a headwind to GDP growth and recovery. You've also talked a lot about not just mask wearing and ubiquitous testing, but really moving toward a more robust health policy. Can you talk about why that's such a focus for you?
Well, again, it gets to what drives GDP growth. Growth in the workforce and growth in productivity. So what do you need to have a growing workforce? You have people who are well enough educated and literate enough and adaptable enough, particularly in a world where technology and technology-enabled disruption is accelerating. Workforce of the future is going to have to be dramatically more adaptable. The graduates of your business school and my former students are going to have to change jobs more often, even change functions more often, and much more adaptable even than we had to be coming out of school. And another part of what helps you grow the workforce is access to healthcare. You got to be healthy enough to work. And so to the extent that there are groups that don't have access, or you don't have good prevention, or you have a very high incidence in your society of diabetes, those are all things that just limit the number of work days you're capable of providing in a country, and just means if you don't address that, you're going to have lower GDP. So I would argue investment in education and in healthcare and improving our healthcare system is an investment that pays off in higher GDP in the years ahead.
Well, certainly you won't get an argument from me on either of those dimensions. You know, I've had, as I mentioned a little bit in my intro, you know, it's been just some amazing challenges and opportunities and innovation going on here at TCU's Neely School of Business. And I'm sure that's been the case at the Dallas Fed and other communities in which you circulate. What have you learned, personally, and then maybe professionally, the most during this whole COVID-19 challenge? Are there any ahas or real deep insights that maybe you hadn't been perceiving, but have certainly taken deep root in your mind?
So two I'd mention. One, and I see this firsthand every day at the Fed, but I see it in the communities that we serve in this district and in the country. People are much more adaptable than we'd think they are, and maybe than they think they are. We have shown great adaptability, maybe more than we thought we were capable of in this crisis. I can tell you, just even at the Dallas Fed, we've had to redeploy a big bulk of our supervision people had to change jobs. in the middle of this pandemic to work much more on our 13-3 programs, you know, these credit programs that we're doing, expanded access to the discount window. I mean, when they started in February, they thought their year was going to look one way, and we've been able to morph and move big groups of people at the Dallas Fed basically on a dime and move fast. I started the year, I had never thought about the municipal bond market. And within 60 days, I'm one of the point people on developing a municipal bond solution. And so you realize you make it up as you go, and we're very adaptable. But that leads to a second point. It's reinforced to me that your level of educational attainment and your literacy, even basic skills, make you more adaptable. And if you've got those basic education skills, you can learn, there's probably not a limit to what you can do. You can learn technology, you can learn all sorts of things you didn't think you could learn. And it makes me realize, and when I see the disproportionate suffering on these lower income and lower education groups, it's reminded me that, boy, there's really, I thought there was an imperative before to improve education, but multiply by 1,000 my realization of that now. This is a huge challenge, and one we're going to have to really work on intensively as we come out of this.
You know, we see that, and, you know, we're very blessed that, you know, our faculty, you know, a number of years ago has made a deep commitment to the power of critical thinking. And we teach concepts such as the entrepreneurial mindset and a growth mindset to make sure that we have, you know, students that understand that, you know, questioning is a good thing. And it's not just about memorizing the answers, but it's about, you know, understanding the context, you know, challenging the status quo, thinking about what needs to change to survive and thrive. And so that's inculcated in all of our curriculum, and so we're really proud of our students and their ability to be those adaptive leaders that we think the world needs. And kind of in that spirit, we actually had a chance to visit with some of our finance majors. It's the largest major here at TCU, and I said, well, heck, I mean, we've got the president of the Dallas Fed on the hook, right? We've got to get some student engagement here. And so they sent me a few questions. If you don't mind, I'd love to share some of the thoughts of our students with you as well. And so here's the first one. One of our finance students said, walk us through the Fed's policy on average inflation targeting, how the learnings from the Great Recession are influencing current monetary policy, including the the aggressive rate cuts, perhaps a lower for longer mentality, and then even the potential open-ended quantitative easing that may be afoot.
So one of the things that I think it's important to do, there's fighting the pandemic. So we were working on this framework review all of last year, and probably started, I think, part of the year before. Then the pandemic happened. And so we're doing a whole range of extraordinary things. We cut the Fed funds rate to zero. People don't even remember this probably, but in January, it's hard to believe, the Fed funds rate was 150 to 175. Over several meetings, we rapidly got to zero. We'd been shrinking our balance sheet, okay, and we'd stabilized it, and we've dramatically increased the balance sheet. Again, but because of the pandemic, not because of the framework. And then these 13-3 programs, meaning the thought that we would be backstopping or providing a penalty bid for corporate bonds, municipal bonds, a whole range of markets, and actually lending to small, mid-sized businesses, that would have been unthinkable. But again, having nothing to do with the framework, that has to do with fighting the virus. So then let's go back to the framework. The framework, to me, is written heavily for over the horizon as we get out of this pandemic. So there's no debate. We're going to have to do extraordinary things until we get out of the woods on this pandemic, and we are not out of the woods yet. And my own view is it's going to be until sometime in probably 2023 before we start approaching levels of unemployment that we saw pre-pandemic. So we've got a good 2.5, 3 years of work to do, and maybe it'll take longer, but that kind of work to dig out of this. And so the framework then is written to me for then over the horizon, although it has some expectation effects now. And what we've said, to go back to the question, what's average inflation targeting? It's not a strict mathematical formula. To my interpretation is, for me, it means we've got a 2% inflation target. We have not hit that target for basically 10 years plus, since the Great Recession, by and large. And it says in the past, what the Fed's reaction function was, when you saw us getting to 3.5%, 4% unemployment or low levels of employment that were thought to be full employment, we would preemptively anticipate inflation, saying you got a tight labor force, you're going to have inflation. So we'd raise rates somewhat preemptively. What we've said is we're going to be a little less quick on the trigger finger. We're going to be willing to take a little bit more inflation risk and run the labor force a little hotter. And we'll be willing to tolerate an overage of the 2% inflation rate as long as it's moderate. And so there's a stated goal that over time, we'd like to average 2%, which means if you go for periods where you're under, we might be willing to tolerate a little bit of an overage. Obviously, there are a lot of people on the committee and we each interpret it slightly different way, but that's what it means. It means that we may be accommodative, for me, accommodative longer than we would have otherwise been. And again, this is all subject to circumstances not changing. The world changes, and I think will change in ways we can't predict today, and we're going to have to adapt to those changes. But all things being equal, that would be our expectation.
Outstanding. Another student question, and they did their homework here. I'm really proud of them. It said, in one of your 2019 essays, you discussed the impact of climate change on the 11th district and the strategies that businesses have been employing to mitigate the tail risk of severe weather and the detriments of climate. As energy is a primary contributor to the 11th district in our local economy, how do you think businesses, particularly in oil and gas or energy broadly defined, can manage their financial success while also joining the fight on climate change?
So the energy business, by the way, is about 8.5% of the state's GDP, probably lower than people might expect. And that's because the state of Texas has gotten so much more diversified over the last 20 years. But when I wrote that essay, and we work on this every week, I think the country would be surprised to learn that the energy companies domiciled here are very focused on alternatives, ways to mitigate greenhouse gas emissions. Suppliers to the industry have to focus on mitigating that. And they're very conscious of the fact that they're going to have to find other ways to produce energy. There's going to be a need for fossil fuels, but alternatives are going to be a key part of the growth. They're also finding that unless they make those changes, they're not able to attract capital. And the private equity funds that would normally invest in the industry, they're struggling to attract capital. And so it's affecting the whole dynamic of the industry. But the other aspect, though, of climate change we work with in this district, we are on the receiving end of these tail events: hurricanes, drought, floods. We don't have the fires of California, but we've got a lot of the other negative impacts of tail events. And all the work we've done, and the National Climate Estimate has said that the frequency and severity of hurricanes is going to go up, okay? And average temperature is going to increase gradually enough that you're going to have water level rises, and it's going to affect Texas. And we're finding that these tail events are extraordinarily expensive. You know, Hurricane Harvey, we think the price tag ultimately, when it's all said and done, could have been 60 or 70 billion dollars. And so these once in a lifetime events are starting to happen every couple of 3 years. And so it's going to affect where people are domiciled in this state, their desire to come here, parts of the state they're going to want to live in, where reservoirs, infrastructure needs to get built to mitigate this. Reservoirs, let's say, you know, outside Houston. And there's not a week that goes by where I'm not having a conversation with either a business leader or a city official or state official that's trying to think about this, because these events are affecting our population and our businesses here. Last comment, we house some of the nation's most critical refinery and petrochemical infrastructure along the Gulf. And to the extent that that the port is compromised or the Gulf is compromised because of severe weather events, it affects the whole country. So those are all the issues that we're talking about regularly.
Yeah. Well, it sounds like some of the private sector leaders are definitely, again, sensing the environment and making a number of those, adjustments so that they can continue to compete and serve the broader economy, given the underlying nature of energy and its ability to propel so much of the rest of the economy, which is a good thing. Last student question. What's your favorite part about working for the Federal Reserve, and what career advice do you have for a student looking to one day serve the Fed?
So, I had the benefit, I had two other careers before I came here. I was an investment banker for 23 years, business person. And then I was a professor and senior associate dean at Harvard. And I had all the experiences that went with that. I would say the academic experience probably was the most useful background in coming to the Fed, ironically, because the Fed in many ways has got a lot of aspects of an academic institution. And so what do I like best about my job is, number one, thinking about how the economy works and how the world works is really interesting, and I've enjoyed it my entire life. I've been watching the markets every day since I was 11 or 12, taught by my dad. But trying to understand how the US economy works and how the world economy works and how it interacts with markets, I would do that for free. If I weren't in this job, I'd be doing that 3 or 4 hours a day. For this job, that is my job. And then the other thing I love about it is I'm relatively independent. And while I have a board, and obviously there's a Federal Reserve, the Federal Open Market Committee, I'm encouraged to state my views, do my work with my team, and say what I believe. So I don't have to pull many punches in this job, and I'm always focused on what's the right thing for the country. What's the right thing for the country? What's the right thing for the country? And sometimes it takes a long time. You agonize over that, but I think that's really interesting and fun. And then the people of the Fed are great, and they're motivated by the mission, and they're outstanding people. So if the most important advice I'd give to people thinking about their career is a question I always ask is what do you love?
Mm-hmm.
What do you have a passion for? And I used to teach this for years, and I wrote a book about this. A lot of people in their 20s and in their teens, they don't know the answer to that. A lot of people in their 40s don't know the answer to that, by the way. But that's still the key question, is what are your strengths and weaknesses, and what do you have a passion for? And I would say, try to figure that out. Try different things. Think about when you were at your best in your life. Where did you shine? What tasks were you performing? What was the mission? What was the atmosphere? What do you learn about that? And I think that should be the primary thing you think about, and how that matches your skills and what career you pursue. And if that's the Fed, if you love the markets and you love to figure out how the world works, and you believe in the mission, it's a fantastic place. But it's got to fit with your passions.
I think it's great advice, and I know we have a number of students on the line right now, so hopefully they're heeding that. Another great thing about this speaker series is that it's not just for faculty and staff and students, but it's also heavily oriented to the business community. And so we asked a number of the participants if they had some thoughts, if they had some questions. And so I'd like to share a few inquiries from our business leaders. One business leader asked, with the extreme challenges of our time, how do you think about the challenge of maintaining the morale of your team? And are there any techniques that you would recommend leaders, business leaders in particular, to leverage during these times to really enhance the performance of their organizations?
Yes. So I have a philosophy on this, and I used it in my business career, and I taught it at Harvard, and I've brought it to the Fed. So I think it's very motivational to your team to answer, for you to ask 2 or 3 questions. And oh, by the way, it's very motivational for your team as a leader. What is leadership? Leadership is about asking the right questions. You don't need to have all the answers. And I think by asking the right questions and making sure you take advice and listen to your people, that's very motivational. But as you do that, there are 2 or 3 questions in particular I'm always focused on here at the Fed. What do we do that's distinctive? What are the 2 or 3 things we need to do to be a great reserve bank and to be a great central bank? What do you do that's distinctive? And where does your business, where does it add value? And if the answer is, well, I don't know, we do the following, we've always done it, that's not the answer. You got to think, in light of where the world is today, what do we do that's distinctive? And I would gauge your people in that discussion. Your people who are at the point of attack, they got a darn good idea what's working with customers or clients and what's not. So what are the 2 or 3 things we do that's distinctive? And there's not a meeting I go to. We did a town hall yesterday. I start every single meeting talking about that. There's not a meeting I have where I don't talk, this is what we do that's distinctive. And I'm always talking to people about how to adjust that. Number 2, what are your top 2 or 3 priorities to achieve, to add that value that's distinctive? Not 7 priorities, because once you start getting to 7 or 8 or 9, it's the same as 0. What are your 2 or 3 top priorities? Priority is a task. What are the things you must do extraordinarily well to add that value? And then the third question is, where are you out of alignment? Do you have the right people? Are they deployed in the right way? Are your incentives right? The way you're organized? Where you're allocating resources? And so I have that conversation with our team regularly. Here's what we do that's distinctive. Here's how we're doing on our priorities. And here's where we're out of alignment. And I share that with people. And what that does is it empowers them. They are read in. So I want them to know, if Rob Kaplan isn't here, we can't reach him. I have a pretty good idea what he'd want me to do in this situation. And so I think that type of communication and making sure you're asking questions and always listening to your people and amending those things, for me, I found that to be highly effective and motivational in managing a team.
I mean, that makes a ton of sense, right? You're really grounding the team, with consistency and regularity. You're giving them awareness as to, we're going this way, not that way. You're empowering their ability to make decisions, so you don't have to see everything come across your desk. And ultimately probably driving loyalty, right? I mean, someone's empowered and can see where they fit in the world and the difference they're making, probably engenders a ton of confidence and loyalty to the organization, all of which have tremendous benefits.
I'll make one last comment that what goes with it. One of the great aligners you have as a leader is coaching. There's mentoring and there's coaching. Mentoring is giving people career advice and they come to you with a story and you give them a sense of it. Coaching is from direct observation. What are their strengths and weaknesses? And being able to, in a candid way, in a constructive way, have regular conversations with people. I think that's an essential aligner that I think people don't probably normally do well enough.
Well, in that spirit of mentoring and coaching, one of our business leaders is actually thinking about our college students. They say college students have experienced a massive disruption to their studies and the college experience in general, obviously due to COVID. What advice would you give a student on how to take advantage of this moment, right? Not only minimize the impact of the disruption, but really transition a hard situation into an opportunity set for their future?
Well, for better or worse, one of the opportunities that come out of this is, I think, having to take classes remotely or more frequently taking them remotely. Maybe, I don't think the world is going to go 5 years from now to all remote, but I think there's going to be a change in degree where I think a good leader or good student is going to have to be adaptable to work remotely and to work in person. And I think to the extent you can get comfortable with working remotely and maintain relationships, learn how to maintain relationships. It's not so easy to do remotely, but learn how to do it. Have one-on-one conversations, seek advice, at least develop relationships. I think those will be good experiences there where you may think that you'll learn that you can work in both modes. And my guess is for the rest of your career, that'll serve you well, because we're probably going to have to learn to work in both modes.
Yeah. Kind of a following question to that. I talked earlier about the importance of culture and how I think it's, just bound up in TCU's success and our ability to get through this. How do you think about culture in a remote or a blended environment? Is it, can you still invest in culture, and can you still build one, even though the time, place, circumstances have changed?
You can, but it's harder, and it changes the way you do it. So as I like to say, culture is not the speech the dean or the CEO gives and says, here's what our culture is. And people privately go away and saying, I wish, don't they realize that's not our culture at all? Culture in the lingo, as you know, Dean, is emergent. It comes as a result of the people. Your leadership style has a big impact. The way you deploy people, the incentives, and it's one of the issues is if you're working remotely, I would argue, and we've done this here at the Dallas Fed during this period, every leader during this kind of period needs to, if you needed to over communicate with your people in a normal environment where you're all together, multiply by 10 in this environment. So I've told to every people leader here, I want you talking regularly to each of your employees. And we're 1,300 people, but most units are small enough. That will be 20 or 30 conversations every 4 to 6 weeks. And that's not too much. I'm doing them myself, but I think I'm doing much more, and I'm encouraging our leaders, many more conversations, because you don't know what people are thinking, because you don't see them. So you got to call them, and you got to learn to ask questions, and you got to let them ask questions, and you have to listen. And I think with a few changes like that, you can still perpetuate your culture, but you have to understand it's going to be harder. When people are remote and they're isolated and they don't see their peers and they don't see you as frequently, they start developing thoughts in their head where they're not sure what the heck. And this issue of what you do that's distinctive, priorities, and where we're out of alignment, I would say that conversation also needs to be ramped up so people feel part of it. And so more town halls, more group meetings, but more one-on-one meetings. So for the leader, means a lot more communication time, in my opinion.
I think it's great counsel, and sometimes that's hard to do, but it's more important now than ever. I mean, particularly when you're scrambling to keep the lights on or stay afloat, and it's just one thing after another. But taking that discerned moment to communicate, to explain, to contextualize, even the rationale for a decision that's been made is terribly important.
And this is where we give lips. When I talk about our top 3 priorities, normally in every business I've worked in, attract, retain, and develop great people is number 1. Almost always number 1. It's probably number 1 for you. It was number 1 for us at Harvard Business School. It was number 1 for me at Goldman Sachs. And so if you put it in that context, if you spend 20-25% of your time with your people and thinking about your human capital, it's worth it if that's your number 1 priority. But you have to decide that it's your number 1 priority. And many businesses have decided that a task is number 1, and people don't show up in the real world in priorities, and that's normally why they run into trouble, in my opinion.
Yeah, absolutely. So I've got a fun one for you from one of our business leaders. Talk to us about negative interest rates. We've seen, a hint of that in other countries. Do you think there would ever be a circumstance when we would see negative interest rates in the United States?
I don't. let's put it, based on everything I know now, I would be strongly against it. And my worry is when I look at other countries that have tried it, it's not obvious to me that it's had a positive impact. It clearly has a negative impact on financial intermediaries, market distortions. It makes it, when I say financial intermediaries, borrowing short and lending long is distorted with negative rates. And also in the United States, we have a very big money market industry, and lots of big companies rely on the commercial paper market, which relies in turn on the money market industry. I think you might destroy the money market industry in that form of financing with negative rates. And so I'd need to see more positive, clear positive benefits to want to try it. And right now I don't see it.
Here's another fun one. Talk about the U.S. dollar and its future as the world's reserve currency, and what's the impact of cryptocurrency as we look ahead.
Yeah. So the dollar as the world's reserve currency is a very important issue, and the reason it's so important, it's allowed us to be much higher debt to GDP, and to have 56, 57 trillion present value of unfunded entitlements, which should be unsustainable, this kind of debt growth, but still finance at relatively low rates. If we were to lose that role with the dollar as the world's reserve currency, we would pay more for our debt. And with 20 trillion plus of debt and this amount of unfunded obligations, we would have a serious problem. So it's very critical that we keep it. The problem is, and I would argue we would make a mistake to rely too heavily on this idea that is going to go on forever. In other words, we need to moderate our debt growth now before and not rely so heavily that we'll always have this status. And digital currency and other developments are some of the threats that could undermine the dollar as the world's reserve currency. So, listen, there's a lot, there's digital currency, and then there's the whole issue of Bitcoin and others. And, I would just say the technology, blockchain technology is here to stay. It's going to be with us for a long time. Whether these currencies so far are going to be the ones that become the actually broadly used, I doubt it, but I'm not sure. But my guess is in some other form or in some other way, there'll be a digital currency. And we're going to have to think about it in the United States so we don't lose control of our own currency, particularly from a monetary policy point of view.
Here's a fun one too. Historically, the Fed has prided itself on maintaining a strict air of independence. In an increasingly politicized world, what are the safeguards to ensure the Fed can still do its job without that influence?
Well, so there's an extremely strong culture, I can tell you from inside at the Fed and among all of us around the Federal Open Market Committee table, that we make decisions based on the merits without regard to political influence or political considerations. Now when we're in a crisis like what happened in 08, 09 and the current crisis, what tends to happen is the Fed always works much more closely with the Treasury, for example, in these 13.3 programs. But I think after this crisis is over, I think you'll see us recede again. And I think operating in a way that is divorced from these considerations, political or otherwise, is critical, and I think instills a lot of confidence in the United States, and is really the mark and globally of successful central bank.
Well said. One of the one of the real challenges to leaders today is really focusing on that priority. Attracting, retaining, propelling talent. What should business leaders be thinking about to be extremely good at that priority?
Most important thing is when I say prioritize it, what does that mean? It means prioritize how much time you spend on it and you have your people spend on it. So you know, it's great to talk, oh, we want to attract, retain, and develop, but every time somebody wants you to try to recruit, or they need you to close a, you know, try to get a candidate to come close on someone or to coach someone, you're never available. So that's not going to work. You have to allocate a bulk of your time. And again, the rule of thumb I use on people, you know, it could be 20% of your time. And when people say, oh my God, that's a huge amount of time, it is. But you have to be very intentional about it and communicate to your direct reports that you want them to overweight. And then what are you overweighting toward? You don't delegate hiring. You've got to be involved in hiring. Your people have to be involved in hiring, in my opinion. But your people, the most valuable asset you acquire, you gotta be involved. You've got to coach people. You have to have clear expectations, accurate reviews, and compensation and promotion need to be related to what you say you believe in. So you say you believe in teamwork, but the biggest money makers are the producers who don't believe in teamwork. You're going to have to go back and just, or you're promoting people that don't embody those values. You know, there's mixed signals all the time, unintentional on these things, and those you got to be aligned. But it takes time, and you got to spend your time.
Well, I think that's a great message, and I think it's a great spot to end on. You know, obviously, where we spend our time, you know, where we invest, and where we, you know, ensure alignment to the message we say has everything to do with our success. And we certainly appreciate you spending your time with us here today. We've covered a lot of ground. Certainly, monetary policy, you know, role of fiscal policy right now, as well as you know, sort of human behavior, right, and adherence to the safety protocols, and that direct link to you know, GDP growth, and you know, the overall economic and sort of social benefits that we enjoy. We've talked a lot about you know, career management for our students. You know, really thinking about where they shine, and moving forward in that way. The importance of being adaptable, not just for our students, but really for all of us, as we upskill and educate, and try to invest in our communities to do the same. The importance of culture and how it's emergent, and the role of leaders to not just talk about it, but walk about it, and assure that alignment and that consistency, and the reward systems that go with it. Unrelenting focus on talent attraction. And certainly if the world is requiring that level of change and adaptability, finding talent that can do it, you know, whether it's in colleges or universities, or you know, community-based programs that may exist today or may be forthcoming, kind of programs that we hope to be involved in at TCU as we reach out further into our communities and want to be a positive force for that change. And then candidly, you know, thinking you know, plainly about you know, the U.S.'s future role in the global economy, and the importance of maintaining the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. A lot of great issues, a dynamic conversation from a dynamic leader. We cannot thank you enough for the service you're providing.
Thank you, Dean.
Our country and our state and our district. It means the world to us, and thank you for investing your time, talent, and insights at the TCU Neely School of Business.
Great to be with you, and thanks for all that you do. I appreciate it.
You bet. You're the best. Appreciate you. Thanks everybody for joining us today.